All right, today we are jumping into one of the most puzzling and, frankly, intense encounters in the Gospels. We're talking about a final sermon given by a man on his way to his own execution. Let's get right into it.
Do not weep for me. I mean, just think about that for a second. A man who has been beaten, who is literally carrying the tool of his own death, stops, and he tells the people mourning him, hey, save your tears. It's an absolutely arresting moment, and it's full of mystery.
So, picture the scene. It's the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. Jesus is being marched to his crucifixion, and after being silent for hours, he finally speaks. And it's been called his last preaching of the word. But who he speaks to and what he says, well, it's not what you'd expect.
This whole thing, this brief, super intense encounter, it really leaves us with two huge questions. First, who exactly were these daughters of Jerusalem? And second, what was this terrifying warning all about? Let's tackle that first mystery.
Okay, so who were these women wailing for Jesus? Were they, his followers, just completely overcome with grief? Or was there something else going on entirely? Turns out there are a couple of really compelling theories here.
So on one hand, it's totally possible these were his disciples, right? Women who'd followed him from Galilee, now just watching in absolute horror. But that specific phrase, daughters of Jerusalem, that points to another fascinating idea, that these were actually professional mourners, an official group whose literal job was to show up and perform public grief.
And, this wasn't some weird one-off thing. Professional mourning was a deeply ingrained part of the culture. We're talking about a tradition where even the absolute poorest families were expected to hire at least one flute player and one wailing woman for a funeral. So the sounds Jesus was hearing might have been a paid ritual lament, not just spontaneous sorrow.
But wait, it gets even more complex. Some sources point out that for these women to even be there, watching a Roman execution, was also a courageous act of protest. It was a way to offer comfort to the person being executed, while also silently, or not so silently, condemning the injustice of it all. So their role was this incredible mix of ritual, compassion, and maybe even defiance.
All right, so now that we've got a better handle on who he might have been talking to, let's get to that second mystery. What on earth did he mean? Why tell them to weep for themselves and their children?
He kicks off the warning with this, just bone-chilling line. It's like a terrifying, upside-down blessing. See, in that culture, having children was seen as the greatest blessing you could have. And Jesus predicts a time so horrible, so awful, that being childless will be considered a mercy. A time when being a mother would be a source of unimaginable pain.
And then he follows up with this apocalyptic image, people so desperate, they'd rather be crushed by mountains than face what's coming. Now, this phrase wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It's a direct quote from the Old Testament prophet Hosea. For anyone there who knew their scriptures, this was a clear, unmistakable sign of God's judgment on the way.
So, did this prophecy ever come true? Well, according to many interpretations, oh yeah, it did. Less than 40 years later, in 70 AD, the Roman army laid siege to Jerusalem and completely destroyed the city to crush a massive Jewish revolt.
We actually have historical accounts of this from the historian Josephus, and the stories are just unspeakable, especially for families. Mothers with children faced starvation so bad it led to cannibalism. Survivors were often sold into slavery. When you hear that, Jesus' warning about the blessed barren suddenly becomes this terribly literal, heartbreakingly accurate prediction.
But he's not done. Jesus ends his whole sermon with one final, super cryptic metaphor. It's sort of the key that unlocks the logic behind his warning, but it's presented like a riddle. So let's solve this last piece of the puzzle.
He says, "For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" It's a really powerful image, right? A green, living tree, that's hard to burn. But a dry, dead tree, that's just kindling. So, what's he getting at?
Well, the green tree, that's Jesus. He's innocent, full of life, blameless. The dry tree, that's the rebellious city of Jerusalem, seen as withered and ready for judgment. The logic is just devastatingly simple. If this is what they do to an innocent man, the green wood, what terrifying fate is waiting for the city they consider truly guilty? The dry wood that's ready to go up in flames.
A brief encounter like this on a chaotic street, it could have easily just been lost to history. But instead, it's been preserved and thought about for centuries, and it actually became a central part of a major Christian tradition.
It's actually so important that in the Catholic tradition of the Way of the Cross, which is a meditation on 14 key moments of Jesus' final hours,
This whole encounter is immortalized. It's the 8th station, Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. It's considered absolutely essential to understanding his compassion.
So why does this one moment still resonate so much? I think it comes down to this. In his absolute worst moment of agony, Jesus turns his focus outward. He literally comforts the people who came to comfort him. He takes their fear seriously. It's seen as this perfect living example of loving your neighbor as yourself, even under the most extreme pressure imaginable.
Think about it. In a moment when anyone would be completely consumed by their own pain, this man looked past his personal tragedy to warn others about theirs. It's this profound act of selfless empathy. And it really leaves us with a challenging question. When we face our own trials, whether they're big or small, where do we direct our focus? Is it inward, on our own pain, or is it outward, toward the suffering of others?